Hi, I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. I like to take little pouches like this and do all kinds of interesting things with them. They're great for storage. They work instead of plastic bags I'd be throwing away. But I like to take a flat bag like this and turn it into something that I'm calling fabulous. All you have to do is add a couple of seams at the bottom corners that are called boxing seams. And these two bags actually started out just alike, so you can see the difference it makes. You just get a little more body, and it has sort of a base to it. To me, this bag has a lot more style. Now, one of my favorite new tricks with this is to use an electronic die cutter in place of the pattern. I'm going to show you at the sewing machine a couple of different ways to make boxed corner pouches, but this particular one, let's get it set up and it can be cutting while I describe a little more to you. So I have my pattern on a USB drive. All I have to do is go in and retrieve the pattern, and then select that I want to cut. And we're ready to go. So my cutter's going to take a minute to find out how thick the fabric is, and then it will do the cutting while I talk a little more. This is sort of what the pattern would look like if I had printed it out as a traditional pattern, but one of the advantages to using an electronic die cutter is the cutting mat is bigger than a letter-sized piece of paper, so I can make my bag a little bit bigger. And we'll wind up with something that looks like this, with those nice boxed corners at the bottom and a little extra style at the top where it's curved. Now, it's already finished cutting that out. This is really great if you're doing multiples, because you can do more than one of them so quickly, and they're all going to be cut just the same. So once we've cut, I'll just peel off my scrap fabric, and just like that, I have my fabric ready to sew. You'll notice that it has a right side on both surfaces. That's because I give my bags a little extra body by fusing two pieces of fabric together with a piece of fusible web. It also helps to cut down on the fraying around those curved edges. So now if you'll come with me over to the sewing machine, let me show you how you do the sewing to box those corners. Okay, I'm going to start out with just a plain bag, an ordinary bag that's made with a rectangle of fabric before I show you the one that we just used the die cutter to make. And that's because this will let you see the structure of that boxing so you can fix it in your mind how this whole system works. And I've sewn one side seam. You'll notice I have a really long zipper, and this is my second tip for these little pouch bags. The cost of a longer zipper is hardly any different, and it makes it so much easier to sew up your side seams if you start out with a longer zipper. And this is really important, always be sure that you open your zipper at least halfway before you sew up the side seams, and that's because you won't be able to turn the bag if you haven't opened the zipper ahead of time. So we have side seams sewn, and now we're going to refold the bag, and I'm going to bring my side seam to meet the center bottom. And generally speaking, you'll either have a seam at the center bottom or you'll have a crease, which is what I have here. So I want to line those two up, and then I grab a rotary cutting ruler. I like to use these for this kind of marking because of the grid. And I'm not going to go into the math. If you're a fan of Pythagoras, you're going to see what I'm doing, but if not, don't worry about it. All you have to know is that the amount that we're measuring needs to be 1/2 of what you want your boxed corner to wind up as. So for a smallish pouch like this, 1.5 inches is good, and I'm going to measure 3/4 of an inch from the point right at the end of the seam line in along the seam line. And it's so easy to do that with the rotary cutting ruler's grid because I just line up one of these lines with my stitches and make sure that the 3/4 inch is right under that part of the ruler. And then when I mark, I have a nice line that's drawn, and it's always going to be at a right angle to that seam line, which is the important part. Now I go back to my machine, and I'm going to stitch right on top of the line that I just drew. And I do back stitch at the beginning and the end of these seams. And you have the choice, after you've stitched, whether you want to leave this fabric in place or whether you want to cut that off and just leave 1/4 of an inch of seam allowance. I'm going to leave it in place for this sample. And you can see when you get that turned right side out, there's the boxing seam, just like the one that I showed you right on the pouch over at the table. Now this is where that interesting little notch that we cut into our fabric comes in. What that does essentially is it makes the fold for you, or it makes the seam line for you, I should say. So we fold again so that the side seam matches up with the center bottom crease, and this time that's going to mean that the raw edges match up, and once I've matched those raw edges, go to the machine and just stitch a 1/4 inch seam the way we normally would. And when we turn this bag right side out, you can see that it looks just the same, but this time we don't have that extra fabric inside. We've already cut it off, and in essence we've made our 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now I have one more trick I want to show you for boxing, and this is sort of a fancy corner that I like because it just gives an unusual bit of style to the bag. And what we're doing this time is we're going to fold it so that the triangle of fabric winds up on the outside of the bag instead of on the inside where nobody ever sees it. To do that, you start once again with just a rectangular pouch. And again, we want to be sure that we've got our zipper mostly open. But this time, before we sew the side seam, we're going to make a different sort of fold. I start out by making some marks. I have my bottom, which is the crease or the seam line, and then I mark 3/4 of an inch up, and then I mark 1.5 inches up. And again, that can vary depending on how big a boxing seam you want in the end. And you need to make those marks on both sides, and then we're going to fold. So I take my bottom seam and I bring that mark up so that it matches the 1.5 inch mark. And then I fold back down and back up again. So I wind up with what I call a W fold at the bottom of my side seam. And then put some pins in it to be sure those cut edges all stay together. And you're ready to sew that side seam. And I want to say that we'll have some more information about this on our website in case you didn't see exactly how I was maneuvering that fold. That's one of those things that sometimes you need to stop and take a second look at, so that'll be available. Then once we've sewn through the folded edge and we turn that seam right side out, then you have your beautifully boxed seam with that interesting little dimensional triangle at the bottom of the side seam. I hope that this will give you some ideas for something you can use to add a little fabulous to your bags. I hope it'll be something you enjoy having in your sewing toolbox too.